Was imperialism good or bad? Did imperialism cause, or was it a cause of European success? These are some of the questions we'll be answering at the end of this video, so be sure to stick around to get the full story. We're going to first go over some of the context necessary to fully understand the situation, and then get to the main points. So to begin, of course, today's topic is imperialism, and of course, imperialism is an idea that's been around for centuries, millennia even, but we'll be focusing mostly on the European style of your imperialism throughout the 16th to about the 20th century. So first, I want to recommend something that I'll be using throughout this video to make some points and where I got a lot of these ideas that helps me make this synthesis. So this is a book called *Sapiens* by Yuval Noah Harari, and it's a review of human history, as the title might suggest, right? A brief history of humankind, but also has a lot of interesting analysis that doesn't really give a credence to one side or the other, but does make some interesting points that are definitely valid for a conversation like this. So first, let's go over what goodness is. So if you'll recall episode 2, which I will recommend right here above, we discussed the model of history, the progressive model of history that I described, which is that everything was good in the past because it happened in the past, right? It's not happening now, it's in history, which makes it objectively good. It's a hard philosophy to wrap your head around sometimes, but ultimately it says that everything's good because it's not happening now, and that everything in the past had a purpose because we've either learned something from it, or it set off a chain event for the future. So the example I used time and time again in that video is the Black Death. Of course, the situation in which it occurred was, of course, tragic, and millions of people died. So much of the population in Europe and Eurasia died. However, it cleansed the problem of overpopulation in urban areas, while also setting the tone for higher wages, which allowed for a better Renaissance, right? The Renaissance was by far one of the best things to happen to humanity, regardless of whether you're religious or secular. Its impacts were clear and huge. So based on this, we can clearly see that bad things in the past had a good result. For example, Nazism was, of course, terrible, right? It was terrible for that time. But it was good that it happened when it did, because what it allowed is more international awareness, and of course we overlooked many things like the Rwandan genocide, but the likelihood of something similar happening at such a large scale is so much less. We have a better understanding and better grasp of how not only how to deal with situations, but to spot it when it's beginning to happen. So first, let's go into the negatives, right? Imperialism, I cannot say this word, wow. Imperialism is a very fraught issue now. Right, we have people, of course you have the apologists, but also so many people who now acknowledge the atrocities and the horrors of what happened under European colonial rule in places like India, South Africa, etc. And the Congo, right, as we'll get into. And first, before we get into this, it's important to first ask the situations and the actual historical place that these events happened. And this is where the question, was European success caused by or caused imperialism, comes into play, right? Was it European dominance that allowed Europe to go out and fight, or was it the colonies themselves that allowed for the European nations to accrue wealth? And the answer is, it's a bit of both. Right, Europe at this time had the most technology, and we're talking early 19th, late 19th century, right? This is the time where military technology was finally beginning to develop past simple guns and muskets. This is when the steam engine was invented, allowing for quick transportation, right? The steamboat was absolutely pivotal for transportation of goods, services, and energy. So based on this, you're going to see that, yes, it is partly European success that caused imperialism. It's what allowed it. But it's also the European spirit of Inquisition, which defined their scientific revolution back in the 17th and 16th centuries. It's trying to find new markets and new ideas and new places and new people, and not only to, of course, yes, exploit them, but to also find out new things and use materials and connect with the labor forces of different nations. So something interesting that you do want to note in this is that Europe was not the only imperial nation. Of course, we focus a lot as, European descendants in America, but Japan was the other major imperial power of this time, colonizing its local area. You have Manchuria, Korea, all of the Pacific Islands, right, which I cannot name because there's so many. Japan had a similar story. And so the question is, why is this the case? Why is Japan, while being an Eastern culture radically different from the West, so similar? And the answer is its receptiveness to European or Western, not only practices governmentally, but also their technology. So this photo I pulled up just a few seconds ago was an example. It was documents the European or Dutch, I guess, the Dutch involvement with breaking Japan out of its centuries-long isolationism to trade with the Dutch exclusively. And what made this unique was that at this time and throughout history, we saw that especially the proud East Asian Confucian nations were not receptive to European, especially British or French, control in their nations or even trade with them. Famously, China right before the Opium War, said that they don't need anything from Europe, therefore they will not be interested in trading with their tea, for example. Because at that time, Britain was having a huge trade deficit because they loved tea. But China didn't need anything else, so they were just selling and selling and selling. But they weren't getting anything back necessarily. And that's what makes it different, right? I think it's Jared Diamond, who's a famous historian, although parts of his theory have been debunked. Guns, germs, and steel, right? Guns and steel. It was through power that Europeans were able to actually go to these countries and, do what they wanted. So the answer, was European success caused by or caused imperialism, is more so that European success caused imperialism. Their success in their growing industrial demands necessitated new markets and more material resources. So some other negatives or drawbacks of this would be genocide and the erasure of local cultures, right? We'll touch on genocide and atrocities first. So this is a picture of the Belgian Congo. So Belgium at this time was a large power, right? While it's a small country, it controlled the entirety of the DRC, or what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's the largest nation in Africa and makes up the bulk of southern Africa. And here, rubber was in large demand because of industrial needs of processed goods, right? Tires were all the heat because cars were just beginning to become introduced to the global markets. And therefore, rubber production needed to be high. And rubber was imported from, I believe, South America into this region. Where is it native? I don't know. But they had basically slave labor where people were threatened for getting their hands cut off if they didn't bring in a certain quota of rubber. And these quotas were, of course, unreasonable. And the millions of Congolese people died either through brutality or the simple inability to actually fend for themselves or the families when it comes to the resource side. So this is only one of the examples. For example, Britain caused a famine in India. I forget the exact date, but sometime in the 20th century, because they were importing all of the food, and the Indians are only left with cash crops, right? So millions of people died in that case as well. So all over imperialistic history, you're going to find that there are very, very obvious examples of brutality from the imperial powers. But does this actually mean that imperialism was uniquely bad historically? The answer is no, because again, we go back to the historical model that we presented in the second video, which is that imperialism, despite its many drawbacks, allowed for the future development of beneficial things, right? It allowed, despite everything, the development of greater technology, because some countries were able to progress so much more ahead, right? Believe it or not, or contrary to some popular opinion, Africa and Southeast Asia were severely behind the greater nations such as China, some of the Muslim countries, and especially Europe. Centuries behind even, because the steam engine just put Europe so far ahead when it comes to industrial development. Textiles was a big thing, so was weapons making, arms manufacturers, all of these things put them ahead, allowing for this sort of oppression. And another aspect or a drawback would be the arbitrary borders, which erased or made at least fraught relations with local cultures. So naturally, we've all heard that Africa is a collection of very small tribes, or at least bigger tribes that don't always get along with each other. But in the race for Africa, when all the European nations divided Africa into sections for themselves, they arbitrarily put together these cultures that didn't mesh well always. And what this did is it caused severe friction between these tribes, which obviously friction between major tribes, fundamentally isn't going to be a good thing. And what this did is that created huge infighting, which is still even seen today. And what this in effect did is start to erode the individual tribal cultures as it became more easy to, unite these people under one race or divide them like the Rwandans were by the French. So one other drawback would be the genocide. And the final drawback, which is even being seen today, that is often overlooked in my opinion, is the setting up of poor economic conditions that wouldn't translate to an industrialized economy. So a lot of these African countries are mineral rich, whether this be through, or, material or resource rich, whether this be labor or gold or silicon or, cobalt or gold. I already mentioned gold, diamonds, right? These are very mineral rich countries, but yet they are still very poor. And why is that? This is because primarily, of course, there are, foreign companies that are able to exploit for example, oil in Nigeria and cobalt in, I want to say, Ethiopia, and gold in South Africa. But more importantly, the very fact that resources are the main part of their economy is the main, it's a telltale sign of some sort of interference during the imperial era. For example, America and Canada obviously have the most resources, but we're not seen as resource-dependent nations. And this is because all we wanted to do as imperial nations in the West, right, it was all about resource extraction. So we maximized the infrastructure to be about resource extraction and mining and such, right, oil extraction. And what this does is it creates a resource-based economy, which is extremely, extremely, extremely reactive to the international markets. For example, you're going to find that Brazil does extremely well when resources prices are high for things like iron, right? Or coal as an example, because they're very good at producing, and this drives up investment in that short amount of time. But once the demand goes down and, there's no more demand for what they've supplied, then foreign investments fall, and there's just an on and on cycle of non-continuous investment in some of these countries. And that's what makes a lot of these countries weak in the long term. They're not able to support a long-term economy because so much of their economy and infrastructure isn't based around human capital, which would be tech, your doctors, physicists, people who are able to command higher wages due to their disproportionate value they bring to society. And that's one of the major drawbacks of imperialism, which is that a lot of these colonized populations are subject to poor economic conditions today, mainly due to the fact that they're not set up to have a long-term success. So now let's discuss the positives or the benefits, which are definitely existent and that, are very evident to see. First is, I believe, one of the best things that happened, which is the development of certain Inquisition-based sciences. So science and the scientific method was around since the scientific revolution and was the dominant European ideology in that time. We were barreling towards, development and, questioning whether what we know is true or not, trying to find more evidence, right? Science is about observation, and so we should go out and observe. And what accompanied a lot of these imperial journeys, even to the Americas, right, centuries before, was a group of scientists, trying to be a geologist, someone who knew topography, a biologist, right? It was, I believe, through Magellan that we found out about evolution, basically, when we sent over... No, that doesn't seem right. Yes, well, alright, ignore that point. I think it was a separate mission with Darwin. But during this time, we basically discovered modern linguistics. So one of the biggest ideas in linguistics is the idea of Indo-European, or Indo-Aryan? I think Indo-European, like a Indo-European archaic language, which defined so many of these languages, both seen in the, Indus Valley civilizations and in Europe, right? And what this was only able to be discovered because imperialists who brought scientists and linguists along were able to study certain texts and were able to actually go out and interact with locals and get things that wouldn't be able to be done without actual, a certain spirit and a certain ability to go in and get whatever they want. So one of the big things that did come out of imperialism was the development of sciences, which of course disproportionately benefited one side about the other than the other, but it did increase net understanding of X, Y, or Z. Next, they brought technology forcibly to quote unquote colonized places. So the biggest example would be trains in India, right? The railroad system is still, I believe, 98% of the rails in India were still built by the British. This was a huge project with a country as big and as, with the population as demanding of an efficient railroad system. It's very impressive. So a lot of people, apologists for imperialists, do say that, oh, but the railroads were so good for India. But then, people would say that these railroads were built on exploitation, and it was, the Indian taxpayers paid for them. However, without forcible, but there's a reason that railroads didn't exist in India beforehand, right? It's either lack of organization or the lack of wherewithal to implement this in a way that's already been done before, lack of experience perhaps, that didn't allow them to en masse be able to do such a big project. It was through forcible occupation in places like India, Africa, that these places were able to, be caught up with the Western world. That even now, right, of course, many of these countries are still poor, but their modern cities are good, better, or at least caught up to, if not better, than London, for example, or even New York City or Sydney, right? If you look at Nairobi, for example, that's a beautiful city in a poor country. So how does that happen? And that's one of the trade-offs, right? You get the technology, you get the guns, you get everything you want. In exchange, your country is, of course, imperialized and exploited. So one of the big things that Western technology gave was its infrastructure, right? By trying to achieve your goals of extraction, you ended up accidentally or inadvertently giving them good technology for the future. So again, this is not, apologism for that this was all justified and that they were so righteous, but in fact, looking at it through, again, our historical lens that everything had a purpose and everything was good because it had a purpose. Everything with a purpose is good. I don't know if that really made sense, right? But through that lens, you're able to see that, yes, in fact, there were positive consequences to what we see now as a wholly negative experience. But it's important to see these positive consequences. And the last point I want to make about the positives is an interesting distinction I found between the European wars of imperialism and previous ones. So if you look at, for example, the Mongol conquests or the Muslim conquests of like this 600s, 700s, 800s, right, when the caliphates were the most powerful, these weren't wars of honor. These weren't wars of, where they were at least even saying that they wanted to educate and fix and, bring enlightenment upon the colonized or affected areas, right? The Mongol conquests were famously brutal, and the Islamic, the Holy Wars, right, were not defined by their goodness or even an attitude of goodness. So what makes the European, 19th, 18th century imperialism unique, or at least interesting in my opinion, is the fact that they at the very least, came in with the idea, the justification of the white man's burden, as Rhetoric Kipling put, which is that they have a duty to educate and build schools. And while, of course, the main purpose was to colonize and to extract resources, a lot of these promises were delivered on. And that's very unique. And it's also unique to find out that a lot of these imperial possessions were given up voluntarily by a lot of these countries. Of course, France had their own thing in Southeast Asia, and it was more violent. But, of course, it was costly to maintain these wars and such. But the easy, how easily Europe let go of these colonies in the 1900s is a true reflection of not only how impactful Nazi Germany was, but also the imperialistic spirit that initially existed with this period of time. So it's not like the imperial powers of Rome, for example, which had to fight, tooth and nail to stay alive for as long as it did, or not even like the Mongols, who just simply kept losing wars as they got smaller and internal divisions broke them apart. So an interesting distinction to make about the benefits of imperialism under Europeans was that there was a sort of A spirit of science, B, the accidental, endowment in technology, and 3, the easy, what's the word for it? How easily they let go of their possessions, and the fact that they went in with the idea that they at least should have, in some degree, educate and enlighten, quote unquote, these native populations. So this gets to our takeaways. Was imperialism as a whole good or bad? The answer is it's good. That's only if you look at it through our historic lens. If you take a look at it as a utilitarian lens, of course it's bad. Millions of people suffered at the, how much did an average Briton, actually benefit from imperialism in India? Better, lower prices, maybe, but that suffering was definitely more than the net positives. But if you look at it through our our view of history on this channel or this podcast, you're gonna find that imperialism set up and made possible the liberalization and the the current globalized society we have that allows for free trade, that allows for certain countries to do well. And of course, it would be great if every country develops equally and peacefully and to the same amount of prosperity. But what the truth is it took a lot of exploitation to get the necessary materials to make certain scientific advancements for these countries. So looking at imperialism critically is important, right? Of course, bemoaning what has been done is, I believe, useless because it's already been done and, no one owes anyone anything, right? Because, it was a Wild West back then. But to understand the nuances of whether or not we actually have a net benefit or a net negative due to imperialism is a question in and of itself. So this is a bit of a more jumbled video. This definitely could warrant some more research on my part and a bigger video in and of itself. But I hope I got some of the ideas out that, kind of legitimize this view of imperialism as a necessary step, not a unique evil or tragedy that happened in history. So let me know what you thought in the comments down below. Any critiques, comments, or any reviews would be appreciated. I'll converse as I have been in the comment section down below. Thank you, and it's been the Rhetoric Reviewed.